Okay, I'm recording now, which is good. It didn't automatically start recording. That's okay. Okay, so if you're watching the recording and you have just joined, we just talked about setting default arguments in Python, which you can review in the slides. All right. Donovan, are you raising your hand? Okay, I just want to make sure, sorry. Okay, so now, oh no, I just opened them. Okay, so now that we've talked about default arguments, sorry, my computer decided to open a program. Okay, so we talked about default arguments and assigning arguments in our functions. And so far with our functions, we have only really just run code, and then our code just ends when we haven't written anything else. And it just kind of stops. So as an example here, like we just have been writing functions. This is my function. We put some code here, we put some more code here, and then the function doesn't really continue. It just stops when we stop writing. And that's totally fine. That's how a lot of functions work. But we could actually do something else with that to make our functions more usable with other parts of our program. So we can kind of make it to where our functions can communicate with other parts of the code by, just like we send arguments or pieces of data to our function to use, our function can respond in a way and send data back after it does its calculations. So this is called return value. So if a function returns a value, it is sending its results back to whatever called it. So just as a quick example here, you can define your function, you can do whatever code you want. And the simplest way to use a return value is to just say return. And so we'll talk specifically about how to use this, but this would be an example of a function that returns something. In this case, it doesn't return anything, but the return keyword kind of signifies like your function ends and it's done doing whatever you wanted it to do. So like I said, you use the return keyword, and sometimes you can follow it with a specific value, which I'll show, but sometimes you don't have to do that at all. If no value is given, like I said, it's called a void function. You might hear that if you continue on with programming. A void function is a function that has a return value, but doesn't necessarily return anything, or sometimes it doesn't have a return value at all.
Does this remind me of the void method in Java?
Yes, it's very similar to that. Yeah, some noise. Yeah, very similar to that. Yeah, make sure to raise your hand, especially now because I can't see you guys. But yes, a lot of programming languages also define functions more strictly. So they might actually call functions void. So yes. But the purpose of the return is to just send a value back to whatever line in your program called it. And usually what you want to do with that is assign it to a variable. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So in this one, we are writing a function called multiply by 2. And what we want it to do, kind of in the name of it, is to multiply a number by 2. So we say new number equals number times 2, and then we say return new number. And this means that our function creates this new number that is just the original number times 2, and then it returns it to whatever line called this. So how could we use this is when we call the function, we can say, okay, we want num to equal 4, and then we're going to have a new variable called num times 2. We're going to actually assign this to our function call. And this will just assign whatever this function returns to this variable. So now, so we say num times 2 equals, and we call our function, inputting the number that we want. This function returns the new number. So now num times 2 is equal to whatever our function calculated. And if we print this, it will print exactly what the function returned. So in this case, our num is 4. We put that in here 4. So if we go back up to our function, new number equals number times 2. So 4 times 2 is 8. Now return new number, which is equal to 8. So this equals 8. And if we print it, that's exactly what it'll print. So I'm going to show you this in Replit. So let's say, so we have this one. We have the num sum that we did. I'm going to get rid of these default arguments because I don't want them. And instead of just printing num1 plus num2, we could say, we could assign it to a variable, but you don't have to do this, but I like to usually assign it. So I'm going to say number sum equals num1 plus num2. And then we use the return keyword. So we say return number sum. Now, in our main function, we can call this. We want to assign it to a variable. So we can say, we can actually call it the same thing if we want. I'm going to call it, see, so if you're wondering why I'm not just calling it sum, that's because sum is a Python keyword, which we haven't talked about, but sum actually means something to Python. So if you assign a variable to it, Python will get upset sometimes. Sometimes it won't tell you it's upset though. So you just kind of have to figure it out when your code doesn't work. So yeah, I'm going to call it number summation, because I want to show you that you don't have to name it this. It's equal to num sum 3 and 5. Now, if I want to print number summation, it should print 8. Yeah. So this is just a way, when you use a return value, it's a way for you to be able to send out whatever your function did, send it back to where you called it. This is really useful. So you can just assign it to a variable like this instead of having to print it. So let's do another example like the one in the slides, where we have def multiply by 2. In this case, we're going to take a number. Don't forget your colon. And now we're going to say new number equals num times 2, and then return new number. So if I want to use what this function produces, I can just assign it to a variable. So I'm going to say new number equals multiply by 2, and then let's say 16. And if we print our new number, it should be equal to 16 times 2, which is 32. And there we are. So that's how you use return functions. So does anyone have any questions for me about return functions? We're going to spend most of our time on practicing this. So if you don't quite get it, we'll try to practice it. So does anyone have any questions? Also going to check the Discord. All right. Not seeing any questions pop up. Does anyone want to let me know? Are there no questions because it's confusing? Or are there no questions because you just want to work on examples? Or are there no questions because you already know all of this? You don't have to tell everyone, you can just message me. But I just want to make sure everyone's understanding. Okay. So I think it's a bit of a slower day today, or not slower, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands how to practice functions with return values. So we're going to do a couple of these exercises all together. So if you already know this stuff, or if you've already got it, feel free to work ahead. And then I have some extra exercises you can work on. But as a class, I'm going to go through this exercise here. So write a function that takes, oh wait, we already did this. Write a function that takes 2 numbers as arguments, adds them, and returns them. That was exactly what we did. Whoops, it worked ahead. Okay, so now we're going to write a function that returns true if the number is even, or false if the number is odd. So starting off, we're going to write our goal up here. Goal, return. Write a function that accepts a number as an argument. Return true if even, false if odd. Okay. Okay, yeah. So that's a good comment. Someone said, don't really get like why you need to use return functions, but you understand the concept, and that's perfectly fine. So the code that we're writing right now is not super complicated like you would need to support like a whole application or website or something. So we're just doing like smaller examples. But if you continue to learn programming, return functions will really be handy. So as long as you understand the concept though right now, that's perfectly fine. All right, so now let's write a function that accepts a number as an argument, return true if even, false if odd. So we want to define a function. So I'm going to write f, and I'm going to give our function a name. I'm going to call it is even. And then what should I put inside these parentheses? Go ahead and type in the chat what I should put inside the parentheses. Yeah, exactly. So we want to put some sort of argument there. And so I always use num to stand for number, but you can really name it whatever you want, as long as you know that that's your argument. So we can say is even num, since everyone likes that convention. Okay, and now what do we need to do to check if our number is even or odd? What kind of statement do we need? We learned about a couple statements and we haven't talked about them in a bit. So I want to make sure that you know.
Is it else if statements?
Yeah, an if else statement. Make sure, I know you're raising your hand, but make sure you raise your hand so then I can call on you. But yes, so we're wanting an if statement. And yeah, Yasha put it in. We want to check if the number modulo 2 is equal to 0. So great. You guys have not forgotten if statements. So we're going to say if num modulo 2 equal 0. We want to return true. So you don't have to put your return statement at the end. You can actually put it in the middle of your code, which I'll show you. And this will end your program. The return ends the program. So if our number mod 2 is equal to 0, we will return true and it won't run any other code. Now we could have an else statement here. We could do else, return false, but I ask you something. If we have this if statement, let's say our number is 3. So it says if num mod 2 is equal to 0, and it's not because it's odd, then it'll go down here either way. If the number is even, so like if we have 2 here, it'll return true and it won't look at the rest of the code no matter what's there. So really, you don't even need this. If you want this, if you want to keep the else statement, that is totally fine. But since we have a return statement that ends the code, we could just put at the bottom here, return false. You don't even need the else. Does that make sense? I'm hoping it does. We'll do a couple more examples of it, but definitely put into question if you're like, no, why did that work? Let me know. But the reason here, I'm just going to go through it again to make sure you understand, is that we're going to say if the number mod 2 is equal to 0, return true. So if that's true, we're just going to return true, and this return means stop. And it'll stop, it won't read the rest. If it's false, this if statement will be false, and it'll go down here and run the rest of the code, which will know that we'll have to return false. So if we want to call this, we can just call it. We don't have to assign it to anything. So we can just say is even. Here, I'll print it so that we can see it. Print is even 6. And that prints true. And now if we do print is even 9, it returns false. So you could also, if you wanted to use this like as a Boolean in your code, you could say my Boolean equals is even like 7 or something. And then you can say print my Boolean, or you can do some other code with that. So are there any questions about how this worked? Okay, what is the difference between print and return? Yeah, that's a great question. So print literally just prints to the console. So print will take whatever you have in here, and it will print. I'm going to get rid of this so it doesn't. It'll print whatever is in here. You can't use that in the rest of your code. So if we said like my number equals print 6, that, and then we want, if we say print my number or something, Python will get confused because this print statement is just printing to the console. It's not actually giving it a number. So it'll say like none or something. So the print statement doesn't do anything with your code. It just shows it over here. It lets you look at it. The return statement actually takes basically this call is even 2, and it makes this equal to whatever the function returns. So it's basically saying this will be equal to true if it returns true, or false if it returns false. So when we say like my bool or something is equal to is even 2, the reason we're able to assign it like this is because it returns a value. So now if we say, print my bool, that will just show us the value. If I don't, so I'm going to comment out this print statement. And just because there's a return value, it's not going to show anything to us. But now when we print it, it'll actually print it out on the screen. So I hope that answered the question. Let's see. Yeah, so someone's saying, it's kind of just for displaying text. Are there any other questions about this? Let's see what else we have. Okay, so our next one is a bit just adding on some stuff to that same problem with lists, but I want to make sure I answer everyone's questions. I'm not seeing any come through, but we'll go ahead and work through the examples, and then if you have questions at the end, you can ask me, and if you don't, then you can go be free. So let's see. So this one says, write a function that takes a list of numbers as an argument, and then return a list of Booleans representing for each number whether that number is even. So that's a lot of words, but basically, if I give you this input, this is a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the output should be for each number in here. If it's even, put true, and if it's false, if it's odd, put false. So for this first number, we have 1, so it should be false. 2, so it should be true. 3, so it should be false. 4, so it should be true. And 5, so it should be false. So basically, I'm giving the function a list of numbers, and I want it to return back another list that has whether each number is that has true if the number is even, or false if the number is odd. So a little more trickier, but this is actually way more relevant to the kinds of things that we can do with Python, especially with data. So it's very close to, or it's getting close to kind of what I do with my job when I'm processing data with Python. And I see a question, what do I mean by go be free? I just mean that we may end early if we get through these exercises and you don't have any questions, you could just go. So, because I'm just gonna be working on these exercises and answering questions until the class ends. Okay, so we want to modify our is/even function. We want it to be able to take a list. So I'm going to rename, we could just keep this as it is. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to say is/even list just to give it a different name. We could keep this as the same, but just to be clear, I'm going to name it num list so that we know that we're accepting a list. Python would still accept like any input that you put into the argument, but we're just going to assume that we know how to use the function and we're going to use it correctly. So we're going to name it num list and treat it as if we already know that it's a list. So we want to be able to take in some numbers, and then for each number in the list, we want to add to a separate list if it's even or odd. So just to break that down, what should we use to go through each number in our list? Yeah, I'm seeing it, exactly. So a for loop. Yeah, I'm glad you guys have not forgotten loops. So it's okay if you have, we'll review them. But so exactly, we want to do a for loop and go through each number in the list. We also want to return a list. We're going to use some fancy list methods here too. So I'm going to go ahead and create the list that we want to return. I'll explain why I did this in a bit. So if it doesn't make sense, I'll talk about it afterwards. But for now, I'm just going to say bool list equals just an empty list. The reason I'm doing this is so that I can add stuff to that list later. So for now, we're going to do a for loop. I'm going to say for, I'm going to say I'm going to say num in num list, because you can name this whatever you want. And sometimes it's easier to read if you name it something that is meaningful besides like just a letter like I. So I'm going to say for num in num list. And now I need an if statement, kind of the same what we did. So I'm going to say if num mod 2 equals 0. We want to add true to our list, to the bool list. I'm going to move this over so you can see it. So I'm going to leave that for now. And then we have else. So if it's nothing else, else. Then we want to add false to our bool list. So does anyone remember, we haven't really used this yet, but does anyone remember how to add values to a list? This is going way back to lists. So it's called a method. What method do we want to use to add to a list? Yeah, exactly. So someone typed in append. So I'm going to show you how we can use this. So for num in num list, if our number mod 2 is equal to 0, so if it's even, then we want to do bool list dot append. And what do we want to append? What should I put between those parentheses for append?
Num?
No, not num. Yeah, we want to put true. So we're making a list of Boolean values. So we want the list to have true in it if the number is even and false if it's odd. So we're going to say bool list.append true. So now let's go to our else statement. So else, if our number is odd, we want to also append. We want to append. So we say bool list.append false. So let's take a step back and look at this. So we created an empty list. The reason I did this is so we could use the .append method. So we already have a list. Right now it's empty. We're going to go through our number list. So for each number in this number list, if the number is even, then add true to our list. If the number is false, with this else statement, else, then add false to the list. And so this will go through each number in the list that we give it, and it will put true, false, depending on if the numbers, each subsequent number is even or odd. So now, very last step, we've done all of that, and now we want to return something. What should we return? Yeah, exactly. We want to return our bool list because that was in our definition. We want to return the Boolean list. So I'm going to say return bool list. So this might be the longest function that we've written for the class. I know some of you have written longer ones because you've sent them to me, but I'm just going to walk through this just to make sure. So we created an empty list. We are going through each number in the num list from up here. If it's even, we add to our empty list true, or if it's false, we add false to the list. And then at the very end, we should have a list of true, false values, and we're going to return that. So now I'm going to say my list. And if I want to make a list called my list, how do I do that? You can put whatever values you want in it. But let's say I want to make a list of numbers called my list. How do I make a list? Go ahead and type in the chat what you would do to make a list. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, seeing some great answers coming in. So yeah, you want to assign that to the variable. So we have my list equals, we're going to have our brackets. And then I'm just going to test with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, because that's easy to just look at. It should be true. I mean, it should be false, true, false, true, false. And now we're going to say my bool list equals, what do we call this function? Is even list. Is even list. And we're going to pass in an argument, my list. And now I'm going to print my bool list. So I'm going to reopen this so that we can see it. But this should go through our function and then print out a corresponding true or false list. So let's see if that works. And here we go. So it has false, true, false, true, false. And of course, this corresponds to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So just to make sure it works, let's test it on something else. So a little bit more random numbers. So I'm going to have 2, 4, 7, 10, and 9.4. Let's see if it gets that as well. And now we have true, true, false, true, false, which is exactly what we want, because we have even, even, odd, even, float. So not even. All right. Do you have any questions for me? Get a throwback to lists. Okay, let's see. If you have questions, of course, put them in the chat, raise your hand, or put them in the Discord. I think we have a couple more exercises so we can do. Mostly just with these exercises here. So if I click on this, so if you open the slides from Monday, there's some good exercises. I think I put 1 through 4, but I think we might have learned a bit more today. But these exercises are nice because you can type in your answer. It'll tell you if it's right or wrong. So if you want a bit more practice, go ahead and work on these for the last 15 or so minutes of class. I can stay on for the next 15 minutes if you just want to ask questions or do more examples. I can try to come up with some. But yeah, so if you're good, then I hope you have a good weekend. If you want to continue to stay on and ask questions, then feel free. I'll be here until the
I'm
top
good
of
right
the hour. But yeah, again, thank you for being patient with me while I travel, and hope you guys all have a good weekend.
All right.
How do I?
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Okay, so yeah, I see a good question here. So how do I use this in my work? That's a good question. I'm going to try to think of an answer that isn't too specific. So gotta come up with an answer on the spot. So one thing that I do is called machine learning. And if you're not familiar with it, it's basically using really, really complicated math to have computers learn patterns in data. So you're just looking for patterns in data. And if I was going to write a function, a machine learning function, I'm not going to get into the specifics of exactly how I would do that, but I would use functions to do that. So I'm just going to write like a dummy machine learning function. So let's just say to define machine learning, and I'm going to put data in here. So data is just, I work with data all the time. All I work with is data. And it's usually a lot of numbers. Sometimes it can be strings as well, though. And so if I want to write some kind of machine learning function, now this is not going to be real machine learning, but there's going to be some code here with some math. At the very end, it should slowly transform my data, usually just with math. So we're applying a lot of complicated math to data, and we're using Python to do that because computers can do math a lot easier than I can do math, or anyone. And at the very end here, I'm going to get some sort of transformed data set. So it used my data to make some calculations and then returned those calculations to me. So it's kind of like when we had the is/even function where it returned true or false for each number. You can have machine learning functions that return like categories. So we can say true or false. Like if we wanted to test, one popular example is looking at transactions online and seeing if you think they're fraud or not. So if someone is using money that's not theirs, you can actually do some really complicated math and come up with a prediction for each set of transactions if it was most likely fraud or not fraud. And so basically it would go through a list kind of, go through each of those groups of numbers and then return true or false, fraudulent or not fraudulent. And so at the end here, after we've gotten in the data, we've done some math on the data, we end up with that transformed data set, and then you return it. So I would say like return the new data set or the new data. And then I would use that maybe to, in my main function, I could use that if I say like new data equals machine learning. I've gotten some errors in here because my internet is being slow. It's not letting me. Okay, there we go. So like I said, this is, oh man, I messed it up. It's okay, you know what I mean. So if I have like this new data here, then I can plot that data. I can say like plot new data. That's not a real function. You need some extra libraries in Python, which we'll talk about. But that's an example of how I would use a return in a function, is passing in my data to that function, getting the new data, and then plotting it. So I hope that was a good enough example. I'll try to come up with a better one next time. But hopefully that satisfied you for now. Are there any other questions? I love that question though. It's really not. It's really not that hard. Once you have practice with it, it's not too bad. Especially because there's a lot of predefined. All the math I was talking about, it's all pre-written by someone else, so you're not having to do all the math yourself. I'm going to stop recording now.